Rain doesn't care what you paid for your tent. I was standing under a hemlock ridge last October, hat brim running water like a downspout, fire still burning 30 feet behind me in steady rain. Not luck, not expensive gear. Every decision made before that rain arrived was working exactly as it should. Old woodsmen didn't cancel trips when rain came. They called that Tuesday. Stay with me. Number 11 is the camp layout mistake most people make before the first drop falls. And number 3 is what most people throw away. Subscribe if you want more of this. Number 20, read the sky before it reads you. There's a moment before serious rain when the forest gives you a warning, if you know what it looks like. Birds go quiet. Squirrels drop into their holes. Leaves on the hardwoods flip silver side up because changing humidity affects how the stems hold moisture. Smoke from a fire drops low and spreads out instead of rising. These aren't folk tales. They're physical responses to dropping barometric pressure that have been reliable longer than weather apps have existed. I've watched a ridgeline stack clouds for 40 minutes and had my tarp rigged, fire platform built, and gear covered before the first drop hit. The clouds compress against high ground first. Color shifts from white to blue-gray at the base. Wind picks up and then goes oddly still. That's your warning window. Act in it or scramble in the rain. Your phone battery dies in cold, wet weather faster than you expect. The sky doesn't. Number 19, choose ground that drains. Flat clearings look like paradise when you're tired and the light is going. They're wide, open, easy to set up on. In steady rain, they become shallow ponds. Water moves to the lowest point, and if that lowest point is under your sleeping pad, you're waking up cold and soaked around 2 in the morning. Old woodsmen looked for a slight natural slope, sandy, rocky, or rooted substrate that sheds water rather than absorbs it. 6 to 12 inches of elevation above the natural drainage line is enough. You're not looking for a hill. You're looking for a position that gravity will drain for you while you sleep. The forest doesn't care about your comfort. It only cares about gravity. Work with that or sleep wet. Number 18, the ridgeline trap. High ground feels safe. It's exposed. People pitch on ridge spines for the view or because they think they'll stay drier above the valley fog. What they get is wind-driven rain coming in sideways, no canopy overhead, and lightning exposure on top of everything else. The smart position is mid-slope. You get drainage below you, a windbreak from the ridge above, and canopy coverage from the trees that grow densest at mid-elevation. I camped mid-slope once, while another party set up on the ridge above me during a fast-moving storm. By morning, their tarp had been stripped. My camp was dry enough that I had coffee made before they finished wringing out their sleeping bags. High ground wins in floods. It loses in storms. Knowing which situation you're actually in is the whole game. Number 17, dead canopy versus live canopy. Not all trees shelter equally, and the ones that look most impressive often shelter least. A big, open canopied hardwood in full leaf looks like a roof. What it actually is a collection system. Leaves catch rain, funnel it to their edges, and drip it in concentrated streams. Stand under the perimeter of an oak in heavy rain and the drip lines hit harder than the rain itself. Evergreens work differently. Dense spruce or fir canopy intercepts rain and slows it. A mature spruce with tight lower branches can keep the ground beneath it significantly drier for the first 20 minutes of a storm. Long enough to build a fire platform and get something going. I've sheltered under spruce, while others fought rain-soaked tarp lines in the open. Not all shade is shelter. Know which kind of canopy you're standing under before the rain starts. Number 16, wet feet kill morale before they kill you. Waterproof boots have a ceiling. After enough hours in standing water, after enough miles on wet trail, water finds its way in. Modern waterproofing is a convenience, not a guarantee. Old woodsmen knew wool stays warm even when wet. Cotton doesn't. Cotton holds moisture against skin and pulls heat away from the body at a rate that makes people dangerously cold before they feel fully cold. I keep spare dry socks in a sealed dry bag that doesn't get opened for anything short of an emergency. At camp, I'm in dry wool. Working in rain, I accept wet feet but manage them. Dried near the fire when I can, aired when I can't, and never dried so close to the fire that leather cracks or adhesive softens. On day 3 of a wet trip, the man with dry socks makes decisions. The man without stops making them. Cold feet reach the brain faster than cold wind. That's not a saying, that's physiology. Now, let me stop here for a moment because there's something worth naming about those first 5. They're not comfort tips. Every one is about noticing a problem while you still have time and options. Reading the sky isn't weather forecasting. It's buying yourself a window. Choosing draining ground isn't about comfort. It's about not waking up at midnight fighting a problem you had 2 hours to prevent at sunset. Old woodsmen didn't react to weather. They anticipated it. That gap between reacting and anticipating is what separates a functional camp in a downpour from a wet, miserable night. The next cluster gets into mechanics, fire, shelter, and the techniques that let you stay productive when everything around you is soaked. Number 15. Fire in the rain. Platform first. The mistake is trying to light wet ground. People pile wet leaves, break wet branches, and wonder why nothing catches. The fire doesn't fail in rain. It fails because wet ground absorbs heat faster than the fuel can generate it. The fix is a platform of split wood, wrist-thick pieces, bark side down, laid tight enough to create an elevated dry surface. Split wood has dry heartwood no matter how wet the outside is. The platform insulates and elevates. Heat builds instead of dissipating into cold soil. On a river gravel bar in steady rain, I had a fire going in 12 minutes using this method. Everything around me was soaked. The fire didn't care because the fire wasn't touching wet ground. Get the platform right and everything else works. Skip it, and you're burning matches you can't afford to waste. Number 14. Feather sticks are not optional. Modern fire-starting products are good at masking bad technique. Waterproof matches, ferrocerium rods, chemical starters. They cover a lot of sins in dry weather. In sustained rain, when those products are wet or exhausted, you find out fast whether you know how to make fire or whether you only know how to use a product. A feather stick is a piece split to its dry heartwood with thin shavings curled back still attached. The shavings create surface area. The dry heartwood feeds the flame. The structure holds together so the fire builds rather than collapsing. It takes a sharp knife and 5 minutes of practice before the rain. And in the rain, it takes the same time and works the same way. I've carved feather sticks sitting under a hat brim in a downpour and caught fire on the 3rd match because the preparation was right. A knife and a dry core beat a fancy lighter every time. Number 13, the bark trick. Most people walk past. The forest keeps dry material hidden from people who don't know where to look. Inner birch bark contains natural oils that resist moisture and ignite even when the outer bark is dripping wet. Peel the outer layer and the inside is dry. Dead lower branches on conifers, the ones hanging close to the ground at the base of a pine or spruce, stay protected by the canopy above and dry out over months. They snap clean and catch quickly. Walking a wet trail, I can assemble a fire kit from what others stepped over. Inner birch bark stripped from a fallen log, dead lower twigs from a white pine, fat wood from the resinous root juncture of an old stump, which stays dry and flammable regardless of conditions. The forest hides its dry spots. They're not obvious unless you know where to look. Number 12. Tarp angle is not a guess. A flat tarp in heavy rain becomes a water collection basin. People pitch nearly horizontal because it feels stable, and then at midnight they hear the sag, and the structure dumps a gallon of cold water across their camp. Tarp pitch is geometry, and it has to be right before the rain, not adjusted in the dark with cold hands. The angle that works is steep, 30 to 45 degrees on the primary weather face. Ridge pulled tight and high, leading edge angled to block wind-driven rain, but low enough to reflect fire heat back into the shelter. Guy lines tensioned with room for natural fiber to swell, if that's what you're using. Side pullouts staked wide enough to shed water away from your sleeping area. I've adjusted pitch mid-storm as wind direction shifted, and a 10-minute fix early in a storm is manageable. A structural failure at 2 in the morning when you're cold and disoriented is a different problem entirely. This is the camp layout decision I mentioned at the start. the one most people get wrong before the first drop falls. Your tarp's angle relative to wind, fire, and water flow determines whether you sleep or shiver. Let me stop and name something that's been true of every tip so far. Every one of them required doing something before the emergency arrived. Reading the sky, choosing ground, angling the tarp, building the fire platform. The people who struggle most in rain aren't unlucky. They're reacting. They trusted gear they hadn't fully understood. They trusted clearings that looked flat. Old woodsmen didn't trust appearances. They tested, adjusted, and built margins into everything. The next cluster moves into the less obvious skills, the ones that separate surviving a wet night from functioning through 3 days of rain without losing your edge. Number 11, camp layout. The triangle of survival. In dry weather, a disorganized camp is an inconvenience. In heavy rain at night, it becomes a real problem. Distance costs heat. A path between shelter and fire that requires thought is a path that slows you when slowing down means cold. What I use, and what was taught to me, is a functional triangle. Shelter at the apex, fire at one base corner, gear storage and wet clothing at the other, under its own cover. Every path between those 3 points is short, memorized, and passable in complete darkness. I don't need a headlamp to get from my sleeping area to the fire and back. I know exactly how many steps, what's underfoot, where the low branches. In the dark and wet, the distance between your shelter and your fire is measured in body heat. Keep it short. Number 10, the clothing management system. Most people treat clothing as binary, dry or wet, and spend a wet trip failing to stay in the first category. Old woodsmen thought in layers: working layer, insulating layer, dry reserve. Your working layer gets wet, that's acceptable. Your reserve is sacred. The dry reserve never comes out for comfort. It exists for emergencies. When someone is showing early signs of cold stress, when a crossing goes wrong, when conditions change fast. If you use it for comfort and then need it for survival, you've spent the margin that would have kept you safe. At the shelter entrance, wet outer layer stripped and hung before stepping inside. Body heat recovers in minutes. That transition matters more than most of the gear people spend money on. Number 9, water channels and camp trenching. I know what people say about trenching. It feels outdated. It works when 3 inches of rain fall overnight, which is exactly when nothing else will. A shallow V channel cut uphill of your shelter, a hand's width deep, angled to direct water away from your sleeping area. 10 minutes with a folding trowel or a stout stick. I've watched tent floors flood at dawn while the V trench around my setup redirected moving water harmlessly downhill. A $400 tent footprint is a vapor barrier. A properly cut trench is active water management. Number 8, wet rope and knot behavior. Natural fiber rope, jute, manila, cotton, shrinks and tightens when wet. Synthetic rope stretches. They don't behave the same way under rain, which means the tension you set in dry conditions will not be the tension you have at 3 in the morning. I learned this when a ridgeline rigged with wet jute pulled my tarp down onto my face during a rainstorm. The rope had been tensioned correctly in dry air. By midnight, it had shrunk enough to invert the pitch entirely. With natural fiber, rig it with deliberate slack built in. With synthetic, your structure may loosen under load. Either way, check your cordage before dark. Your knots aren't just holding shape. They're managing the physics of a decision you made hours ago, in different conditions. What you didn't account for will be waiting in the rain. Here's the pattern worth naming across everything we've covered. Rain doesn't attack your camp. It reveals every decision you made before it arrived. The tarp angle set in dry air. The ground chosen because it looked flat. The rope rigged without checking what it was made of. Old woodsmen didn't have better gear. They had better habits. Habits that ran automatically so that when conditions turned, they weren't scrambling. They were managing things already working. The final tips deal with deeper skills. How you fuel yourself, how you navigate when visibility drops, how you signal, and the one thing most modern campers throw away before they leave the trailhead. That last one is coming at number 3. Number 7, food and fire, discipline in sustained rain. Cold food and cold rain isn't just miserable, it's a physiological problem. Your body uses calories to generate heat, and when you stop supplying them, heat production drops. A person eating cold food on a cold, wet day slowly reduces their own thermal output without realizing it. Hot food is core temperature management. One pot, simple fuel, minimal exposure time. I've kept my thinking clear through a second full day of rain, while others moved slowly and made poor decisions because they'd been eating cold to avoid dealing with a cooking fire. The discipline pays back everything it costs. Cold food in cold rain isn't just miserable, it's dangerous. Number 6, navigation without visibility. Rain and fog reduce visibility in terrain you thought you knew. GPS units and map apps fail faster in cold and wet than manufacturers admit. A dead unit in familiar terrain is an inconvenience. In unfamiliar terrain with visibility down to 40 feet, it becomes serious fast. The skills that don't fail are compass work and terrain association. Water flows to exits. Drainage leads downhill and out. If I'm disoriented in fog and rain, I follow water, because water goes where I need to go, or tells me which way down is. Pace counting, remembering landmarks before the fog arrived, knowing which way the terrain tilts. Quiet habits that become critical when the battery dies. The mountain doesn't move. You do. Know which way is down. Number 5, signaling in rain and low light. Most people think about signaling when they need it, which is too late in rain. A signal fire built on day 3 from wet material in poor visibility is smoke and frustration. A signal fire with a pre-positioned dry fuel cache covered with overlapping bark and set on a visible high point is a resource you already have. I put signal materials in place on day 1. Dry tinder under a bark cover in a clearing visible from above, a bright piece of fabric laid out as a ground marker, and a whistle as the primary signal, because a whistle carries through rain and fog when a voice won't. None of it takes more than 20 minutes. Distress preparation isn't pessimism, it's completion. The camp isn't finished until the signal option is in place. Number 4, managing hypothermia risk before shivering starts. Shivering is a late-stage warning. By the time a person is shivering continuously in wet weather, their body has already been working hard to maintain core temperature for a while and is beginning to lose that fight. The early signs come before the shivering, and knowing them lets you intervene before the situation becomes serious. Clumsiness with simple tools, fumbling a cup or a zipper twice in a row, slow speech, difficulty choosing between two simple options. These are behavioral signs of early cold stress. I've seen people dismiss them in themselves because they didn't feel dramatically cold. Cold stress doesn't always feel dramatic. It quietly erodes the functions you need most. If I fumble something twice, actually drop it. That's my signal. Stop. Dry layer on. Hot drink. No argument. No finishing the task first. The task waits. The body doesn't negotiate. The body stops shivering when it runs out of energy to shiver. That's not warmth. That's the edge. Before the final 3, I want to name something. The last 4 tips changed categories: food, navigation, signaling, body heat, and each one only matters after the earlier skills are already in place. If your ground is flooding and your fire won't start, you're not thinking clearly about navigation. There's a hierarchy here. The 3 remaining tips are what old woodsmen never forgot because they couldn't afford to. One involves something most people throw away before they leave home. The other is the principle this entire list was building toward. Number 3, the carry nobody keeps. This is what I mentioned at the start. Most people rely on a lighter or a book of matches. Both fail in sustained wet weather. Lighters flood. Matches absorb moisture even from humidity, and they fail at exactly the moment you need fire most. When you're wet, cold, and possibly already showing the early signs I described in number 4. Old woodsmen carried a sealed, dry tinder cache, char cloth in a tight tin, fatwood shavings pressed into wax, dry cattail fluff or cedar bark in a sealed bark pouch. The specific material varied by region. The principle didn't. You maintain a fire-starting reserve in good weather so it exists in bad. It never gets opened for a convenient campfire. It exists for the moment the primary method has failed. I opened that sealed tin on day 3 when my lighter was flooded and my matches were useless cardboard. Fire going in 4 minutes, not luck. I'd packed and protected that tin a week earlier for exactly that moment. The thing you maintain in good conditions is the thing that saves you in bad ones. Number 2, Camp hygiene and tool maintenance in rain. Wet weather is when maintenance gets skipped, and skipping maintenance is how functional gear becomes non-functional gear on day 4 when you actually need it. Blades rust faster in sustained humidity. Handles swell and crack when they dry unevenly near fire. Cordage left coiled wet develops rot at the kinks. Boot laces stretch wet and hardware corrodes. Wool stays damp longer than synthetic if it isn't hung properly. The old habit was a nightly 20-minute routine regardless of conditions. Blade dried and lightly oiled. Wet cordage hung loose, not coiled. Boot hardware dried. Dry reserve repacked and sealed. Wet outer layer hung where it has a chance by morning. It doesn't feel important when you're exhausted. It feels very important on day 5 when your blade is clean and the man next to you is improvising with a belt because his lace rotted through. A tool that fails in the field wasn't ruined in the field. It was ruined the night you skipped 20 minutes. Number 1. The wet weather mindset. Adapt before you react. Every tip on this list is downstream of one habit, one way of thinking about being in the woods in bad weather that old woodsmen had and that modern people have largely lost. They didn't treat rain as an emergency. They treated it as a condition to manage. The sky read and acted on. Ground chosen for drainage. Platform built before fire attempted. Pitch set before wind arrived. Cordage checked for material. Tinder cache maintained and sealed. Reserve layer protected. That's not a checklist you consult in the rain. That's a set of habits built in dry weather until they run without thought, so that when conditions turn, you're managing things that are already working rather than scrambling to build a camp in the dark. Modern people own gear they trust more than they trust their own understanding of why it works. When the gear fails, and in sustained wet conditions it eventually does, there's no fallback because the fallback was supposed to be in the product. Old woodsmen built the knowledge instead. The knowledge became the safety net. I was standing under that hemlock ridge last October with rain running off my hat brim and the fire going 30 feet behind me, and none of it was luck. It was 20 decisions made in the 2 hours before the rain arrived. Decisions that had been made the same way on dozens of trips until they stopped requiring thought. You don't learn to handle rain by watching a video. You learn it the first time you stay dry when everything around you is wet, and you realize nothing felt like scrambling because it was already done. Pick one tip from this list and practice it before the next rain falls. In your backyard, in dry weather, until it's in your hands instead of your head. Tell me in the comments which of these 20 most people skip first. I've got a guess, but I'd rather hear yours. Knowledge like this weighs nothing. It needs no charging, and it doesn't fail when the weather does.